On the worn wooden porch of that forgotten farm, 3 orc warriors were waiting for him in silence. Verka, the tallest of them, stepped forward with heavy strides and called him by name before he opened his mouth. Garrett Colne tightened the deed between his fingers and understood that this land was about to change everything. The sun was already low when Garrett Colne spotted the farm for the first time. 3 days of travel through the arid desert of shadows had left dust pressed into every fold of his clothing. His wide-brimmed hat shielded his face, but not the weariness in his eyes. The horse snorted, as if it too sensed that something about this place hung differently in the air. The dirt road climbed gently toward an old wooden gate. Beyond it, open fields spread under the orange light of the dying day. The main house was simple, its boards darkened by time, with a wide porch running along the front. There was a spring in the hills at the back, and the distant sound of running water was the first thing that surprised Garrett. Water in that desert was no small thing, but what made him stop completely were the 3 figures on the porch. They did not move when he approached. They stood there as if that were their rightful place in the world, and perhaps it was. The tallest of them stood over 2 meters. Her jade-green skin caught what little light remained in the late afternoon. Long hair, braided with small white bones, fell across broad shoulders. Her dark eyes were steady and firm, and they never left Garrett for a single second. He had not yet dismounted when she spoke. Garrett Colne. Her voice was low and controlled. "We were expecting you." He tightened his grip on the reins. He had not given his name to anyone in these lands. No one except the clerk at Dust City knew he was coming. And yet she knew. The other 2 warriors were leaning against the porch posts. One had a direct, measuring gaze, arms crossed over a dark leather vest. The other watched with calm, the way someone watches who has seen this kind of meeting before, and knows exactly how it ends. Garrett dismounted slowly. He took off his hat, not out of politeness, but to see better. The deed was folded inside his vest, against his chest. "Who are you?" he asked. "The women who live on this land," said the tallest without moving a muscle. "And you are the man who bought what was not meant to be sold this way." There was something in those words that did not sound like a threat. It sounded like exhaustion, an old exhaustion carried a long time. Garrett looked at the fields around him. The fences were in order. The pastures had color. There were new structures beyond the old house, built with care and purpose. This was not the neglect he had expected to find on a farm, bought second-hand for a price too low to be honest. Something about this place had been wrong from the start, and he was beginning to feel exactly how large that wrongness was. The jade-green warrior stepped forward and extended her hand in a gesture that was not peace, but clear introduction. "My name is Verka." She pointed to the other 2. "Thorn, Droga. We go inside together, or we stay out here until the cold comes." Garrett looked at the 3 of them, looked at the farm, looked at the deed that felt heavier with each passing second. Then he took a step toward the porch. Inside that house, he had the feeling he was about to discover something he would never be able to ignore for the rest of his life. The kitchen table was old, but it was clean. Verka placed a lantern at the center, and the 3 warriors sat down on the far side. Garrett stood for a moment, hat still in his hand, trying to organize his thoughts before he sat down as well. The smell of wood and dry earth mixed with something softer that he could not name right away. "You will want to see this," said Verka. She placed a document on the table. It was not new. The edges were yellowed, and the ink had the color of something that had seen rain and sun more than once. But the signature at the bottom was clear. Edric Sallow. Garrett knew that name. It was the man who had sold him the farm through an intermediary in Dust City. They had never met. Everything had been done by letter and by a suited man who smelled of tobacco and hurry. He leaned over the document. It was a contract stating that the 3 orc warriors would work the land in exchange for permanent housing, a share of the profits, and the formal transfer of rights to the next legal owner, whoever that turned out to be. "He signed this and then sold the property without telling you," said Garrett. It was not a question. "Sold it in secret," said Thorin. Her voice was the driest of the three. "Disappeared before dawn, left the debts, took the money." Draugr, who had not spoken until then, opened her hands on the table in a simple gesture. "Left nothing beyond what you are looking at." Garrett read the contract in full, twice. It was a real document, written with intent, and it contained a clear clause transferring obligations to the new owner in the event of sale. Edric Sallow had built that on purpose. He had used their labor, made an agreement that looked legitimate, then arranged a clean exit for himself while leaving them trapped in a situation with no easy way out. He folded the contract carefully and returned it to Verka. "Why did you stay?" he asked. "You could have left." Verka looked at him for a long second. "Because this is ours." She said it without anger, with a quiet firmness that weighed more than any shout. "Every fence, every inch of irrigation, every route opened with the settlements, we built it. We do not leave, because a dishonest man decided he could use our work and walk away." Garrett was silent. He looked at the three of them around the table. Verka, with her direct gaze, and the bones in her braids catching the lantern light. Thorn, with her arms crossed, and that expression that measured his every movement. Draugr, with her eyes slightly lowered, but her shoulders straight, no fragility in them. There was no hatred in that silence. There was distrust, yes. There was the weight of a recent betrayal, still fresh and carefully held, but there was no hatred. Garrett pulled the deed from his vest and placed it on the table beside Sallow's contract. "Then we need to talk about what to do with all of this," he said. Verka looked at the two documents side by side. Outside, the wind began to push through the gaps in the wooden walls, and the lantern trembled for a moment, as if something invisible had moved quickly through the room. None of the three warriors looked at the lantern, but Garrett noticed that all of them already knew exactly what it meant. The next morning, Garrett woke before the sun. It was not habit. It was because the farm woke before him. There were already firm footsteps outside, the sound of a gate opening, the distant noise of someone guiding animals through the pasture. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, listening, trying to understand where he was and what he had agreed to the night before. He had agreed to quite a lot. When he stepped outside, he found Thorin crouched near a structure of wood and stone he had not fully noticed the evening before. It was a system of channels, built with precision and patience, carrying water from the spring in the hills down to the lower fields. Thorin was testing a stone joint with her fingers, tapping lightly to check the hold. She did not look at him when he approached. "This structure here," he said, following the path of the channels as far as he could see. "You designed this, with Draugr to measure the terrain," she replied. "It took 2 months. The spring never dries. If the channels are maintained, water does not run short." Garrett was quiet for a moment. 2 months of work, 2 women on hostile land, with no guarantee anyone would ever acknowledge the effort. And yet the structure was there, solid and working. He walked with Thorn through the fields while the sun climbed slowly. The pastures were healthy, the animals well-fed. There was a cultivation area with plants he recognized and others he had never seen, species that Draugr, he would learn later, had brought from lands farther north and adapted to the dry soil of the region. That same afternoon, Verka took him to a small cabin at the edge of the property. Inside was a thick ledger. Every entry, every sale, every arrangement with settlements across the region was written in a clear, organized hand. "This is what Edric Sallow never did," said Verka. "He showed up to take what the land produced and disappeared. We learned that land does not work that way." Garrett turned the pages carefully. The record showed agreements with settlements 2 and 3 days of travel away. There were established routes, delivery dates, negotiated quantities. The farm was not just a property, it was an operation, small but real, built by 3 women who understood exactly what they were doing. When he closed the ledger, he felt something he had not expected to feel that day: genuine respect. Draugr appeared in the doorway of the cabin with 3 cups of fresh water. She handed one to Garrett without ceremony, the way someone offers something to a fellow worker, not to a stranger. He took it and drank. "You are trying to understand whether you can trust us," said Droga directly. That was how she spoke. No softening, no easing in. "And we are trying to understand whether we can trust you." "Seems fair," said Garrett. "It is the only way," she replied. Verka was leaning against the wall, watching. Her green eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen promises turn to dust. But there was something different there, something Garrett could not yet name. A small, cautious opening, like a thread of light through a thick wall. When they walked back to the main house, the sky had already taken on the color of late day, and the shadows of the fields stretched long across the land all three of them had built with their own hands. Garrett felt for just a moment that he belonged to that place. But there was still something unresolved, and he did not yet know how large the problem Edric Sallow had left behind truly was. It was Verka who told him about the debts. She waited for the right moment, the way someone waits who knows that certain news needs solid ground beneath it before it lands. It came on the morning of the third day, with the coffee still warm on the table and the sunlight pressing through the cracks in the window frame. She placed another ledger on the table, smaller than the records book, but heavier in that moment. It was a book of obligations. In it, Edric Sallow had taken out loans in the name of the farm through 3 merchants in the region, using the labor and reputation the warriors had built as collateral. Garrett read the numbers in silence. The sum was large. Not impossible, but large enough that anyone without reserves would lose everything within a month. The merchants had a deadline. When that deadline arrived, the farm, the animals, and everything that had been built could be seized for debt. Less than 4 weeks. "Why did you not go after Sallow?" he asked. "We did," said Thorn, her expression unchanged. "He no longer exists as Edric Sallow. Whatever name he uses now, he is far beyond reach." Draga looked toward the window. "We went to the Frontier Guardian in Dust City as well. They said that without proof of criminal intent, there was nothing to be done. The contract he signed with us is not recognized by the law as a land document. It is only a private agreement." Garrett closed the ledger carefully. He looked at the 3 of them. Verka had her arms crossed, but her eyes were steady. It was not resignation. It was the posture of someone who had considered every possible way out and came to tell him this because the options that did not involve asking for help had run dry. For an Orc warrior of the Green Shadows clan, asking a stranger for help was not a small thing. Garrett was silent for a long moment. Then he stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the fields that stretched beyond the foggy glass, the pastures Thorn kept alive, the channels that carried water to where there had once been only sand, the routes Drauga had opened through effort and negotiation. All of it was about to be taken for a debt that was not theirs. He came back to the table. "I have enough capital to clear this," he said. "I came prepared to invest in the property. I just did not know the investment would start this way." The 3 warriors did not speak at once. Verka studied his face the way someone looks for the trap hidden inside each word. "What do you want in return?" she asked. "Partnership." He said the word carefully, the way someone says a word they know carries weight. "Shared decisions. Mutual respect. The 3 of you keep what you built. I bring the capital and what I know about negotiation in Dust City markets. Nothing more than that." Thorn looked at Verka. Droga looked at Thorn. It was a quick exchange, but Garrett caught it. Verka extended her hand across the table, palm facing up. It was not a business handshake. It was an Orc gesture, he realized later. The gesture of someone offering something real, not just words. He placed his own hand over hers. Outside, the wind passed quietly through the fields, and none of them noticed that in that moment, something old and long forgotten in that ground seemed to breathe again. The debts were cleared in 2 days. Garrett rode to Dust City with Verka beside him. She had not asked to come. She simply appeared ready when he was saddling his horse, a short lance strapped across her back and the look of someone who does not explain their own movements. The merchants received them with distrust. One of them, a short man in a vest stained with coal dust, tried to inflate the total right in front of them, claiming interest that was nowhere in the document. Virka placed her open hand flat on the counter with a calm that was more threatening than any shout, and the man reread the document with actual attention this time. Garrett paid the correct amount. Nothing more. Back at the farm, the three warriors made no celebration. It was not their way. But Thorn spent the entire afternoon mending a fence that did not need mending, which Garrett had already learned was her way of working through something that sat heavy. Draugr simply appeared on the porch that evening with a bowl of warm food and set it beside him without a word. It was a small gesture. It was enough. In the days that followed, something shifted at the farm, not all at once. It shifted slowly, the way water shapes stone without hurry. Garrett began to understand the rhythm of that place. He woke early because the farm woke early. He learned what each field needed because Thorn taught without unnecessary words, only pointing and doing. He learned the trade routes because Draugr opened the record ledger every week and went through every line with him until the numbers made complete sense. With Virka, the conversation was different. She did not teach, she debated. When Garrett proposed something, she listened all the way through and then presented her own thinking with surgical clarity, never softening points of disagreement. He learned quickly that arguing with her was productive, as long as both of them were clear about what they wanted. When they reached agreement, it held. When they disagreed, neither backed down out of politeness. It was the kind of partnership he had never had before. There were nights when the wind carried something strange across the desert, a sound that was not wind but travelled with it. Garrett would wake in those moments and lie still, listening, unable to find the source. Once, he rose and went to the porch and found Virka already there, standing in the dark, her eyes turned toward the hills. "What is that?" he asked. "The spirit of the land," she said without looking away. "It wakes sometimes, when it senses the ground was mistreated for too long and has finally begun to be treated with respect." Garrett stood still, listening to the distant sound that rode with the wind. "Is that good or bad?" he asked. Virka turned her face toward him. For a second, something softened in her expression. "I do not know yet," she said. "It depends on what comes next." She went back inside without another word. Garrett stayed on the porch a while longer, listening to the desert, feeling that this land held old things he was only beginning to learn how to respect. A messenger arrived from Dust City at the start of the second month. He brought a folded paper with the seal of the Frontier Guardian's office. Garrett opened it on the porch, while Virka read over his shoulder without asking permission. The document was a notice of ownership dispute. Someone had filed a contestation against the property, claiming that the original sale made by Edric Sallow contained documentary irregularities. The name on the document was a man called Burdett Kane, a land speculator Garrett knew by reputation. He bought disputed properties at low prices, waited out the legal process, and kept whatever was left. "Sallow worked with him before he disappeared," said Draugr, who had come around the side of the house without making a sound. She had that habit. "We saw his name in one of the old records we found in the barn." Thorn was standing in the doorway. She crossed her arms. "If this goes to a formal dispute, it takes months. Months that Kane uses to pressure merchants into refusing new agreements with the farm. I have seen this before." She said it the way she described weather, cold and direct. Garrett folded the paper and put it in his pocket. "Then we need a lawyer in Dust City before Kane gets there first," he said. "We have been to lawyers before," said Virka. There was a dryness in her voice. "With Sallow still the legal owner, no one wanted to hear us." "The deed is in my name now," said Garrett. "And your contract is signed and predates the sale. That is what we need to present." Virka looked at him for a moment. Have you been to a lawyer before? Never, but I know that documents with dates matter more than words in a land dispute. The trip to Dust City this time was different. All four of them went together. Verka, Thorn, and Draugr drew attention as they moved down the main street, as they always did. But this time Garrett walked beside them without hesitation, which drew a different kind of attention. The lawyer who received them was an old man with thick glasses and a desk buried in papers. He read both documents, the deed and the contract, in long silence. Then he looked at all four of them over the top of his glasses. "Your contract contains an obligation transfer clause that is rare but valid," he said. "If Mr. Colne confirms that he recognizes the document and its obligations, Kane's contestation will fall apart for lack of foundation. He would try to argue fraud in the original sale, but that would require proof that Mr. Colne knew of the irregularities before purchasing, which does not appear to be the case." "I knew nothing," said Garrett. "Then we respond to this notice this week." When they left the office, the sun was already halfway across the sky. Thorin let out a slow breath through her lips, the closest she ever came to a sigh of relief. Draugr looked down the street with no expression, but her hands hung loose at her sides, no tension in them. Verka stood on the sidewalk, looking along the main street for a long moment. "Kane will not give up easily," she said quietly. "No," Garrett agreed. "But now the dispute is his word against 2 registered documents, and documents do not get intimidated." She looked at him. For one brief moment something crossed her eyes that was not distrust, but she said nothing. She started walking back toward the horses, and the other 3 followed. Burdett Kane showed up in person 3 weeks later. He arrived with 2 men in hats and vests, who stayed at the entrance to the property while he walked through the gate on foot. He was a middle-aged man with the broad shoulders of someone who had carried heavy labor in his youth, but had long since made others carry it for him. Garrett met him halfway up the path before he reached the house. "Colne." Kane extended his hand with a smile that never reached his eyes. "I came to talk between reasonable men." Garrett shook it briefly. "Go ahead." Kane looked over the farm around him, the fields, the structures, with the gaze of someone already calculating value. "You bought yourself a complicated property. Sallow was a creative businessman, let us say, and left behind a trail of papers that can be read in more than one way. I can offer you a clean way out. I buy your deed for a fair price, and you leave without any headaches." "And the warriors who built this farm?" asked Garrett. Kane opened his hands in the gesture of someone brushing aside a minor detail. "Private agreements without legal standing are not my concern. They would be notified of eviction." Verka appeared behind Garrett at that moment. She had not been called. She was simply there, standing, her gaze fixed on Kane with an intensity that made the 2 men at the gate take a step back. Kane looked at her and returned his eyes to Garrett. "Think carefully about what you are choosing," he said, his voice lower now. "I already have," said Garrett. "The answer is no." Kane left without another word. The 2 men at the gate followed. Thorin and Draugr, who had been standing along the side of the house, watched everything in silence. When the 3 of them disappeared down the dirt road, Draugr spoke first. "He will come back with a different angle." "He will," Garrett agreed. "We need to register their contract formally at the registry office," said Thorn, "before he finds another legal path." Verka was still looking at the empty road. There was something in her posture different that day, a tension that was not only anger, it ran deeper than that. Later that evening, she found Garrett on the porch. The 2 of them stood in silence for a while, listening to the wind move through the fields. "You could have sold," she said without looking at him. "I could have." "Why did you not?" Garrett took a moment before he answered. "Because what Sallow did to you was wrong, and I did not need the money more than I needed to be able to look at myself in the mirror." Verka was quiet for a long time. Then, slowly, she tilted her head slightly to one side, a gesture he had learned by then meant, in her language, that she had truly listened. That night, the strange sound of the desert returned. But it was different this time. Quieter, deeper, like something that had finally found what it was looking for and stopped moving. Verka listened and closed her eyes for a second. "The spirit of the land," she murmured. "This time it is at peace." The formal registration of the contract took a full week to complete. The thick glasses lawyer worked through the papers with the care of someone who understands that legal language is a minefield. When the final document came out of the registry office with its official seal, Thorn held it with both hands and looked at it for a moment longer than necessary. Droga witnessed the scene without comment. Garrett looked the other way, pretending not to have seen. Burdett Kane's contestation was answered formally 2 weeks later. With both documents registered and dated, his argument fell apart without ceremony. The Frontier Guardian of Dust City sent a short note saying the dispute lacked sufficient basis to proceed. There was no celebration. The farm simply kept running, as it had always run, but now with one less weight pressing down on all of them. The second month turned to a third, without anyone marking the exact day. Garrett learned that the farm had a rhythm that was not negotiable. The land did not wait for bad moods or poorly slept nights. There was always something to be done. Always something Thorn had already calculated would need doing the following day. He stopped resisting that rhythm and started following it. With Droga, the relationship grew in ways he had not expected. She was direct to the point of being uncomfortable, but she was also the first to appear when something was wrong, without asking if the help was welcome. She simply arrived and resolved it. Garrett learned to do the same. With Thorn, communication was almost entirely practical. They could spend hours working side by side without exchanging more than 10 words, and by the end of the day, the work was better done than if they had talked the whole time. With Verka, it was different. There was a depth to that relationship that grew slowly, like the water in the channels she herself had helped to build. She argued, disagreed, gave ground when giving ground made sense, and held her position when she believed she was right. It was the kind of presence that left no room for Garrett to be less than he was. On a hot afternoon, when all 4 of them were repairing the oldest section of the east fence, Droga asked, with no preparation at all, "Did you have family before you came here?" Garrett thought for a moment. "A younger brother. He died of fever 3 years ago. Father and mother went before him." "Alone, then," said Droga. "Until I got here," he said. Droga nodded slowly and went back to the fence without another word. But Thorn, on the other side of the post, stopped her hammer for a second and looked at him. It was a quick look, but it carried weight. Then she returned to work. Verka, a little farther along the fence line, did not look up, but Garrett saw her shoulders shift slightly, the way someone moves when they have heard something that stays with them. That evening, when the sun dropped behind the hills and the desert turned that color of slowly fading embers, the 4 of them sat on the porch that Thorn had extended 2 weeks earlier without explaining why. There was room now for all 4 of them to sit comfortably side by side. Garrett looked at the darkening sky above the fields they had all built together. He felt something that took him a while to name. When he named it, he realized it was simple. He was home. Winter came earlier than the years before. Thorn said so with the same flatness with which she said everything, but she reinforced the animal shelters 2 days before the cold arrived, which Garrett had already learned to read as her way of expressing urgency. The cold in the arid desert of shadows was not the wet cold of other regions. It was dry and cutting, arriving at night without warning and leaving the ground hard until mid-morning. But the farm held. Thorn's channels were adapted for winter with small adjustments she made, alone, in a single afternoon. The shelters stayed firm, the animals healthy. The trade agreements with distant settlements continued working because Drauga had negotiated with the seasons in mind, something Edric Sallow had never once done. Garrett wrote the new routes into the record ledger in careful handwriting and handed it to Drauga to review. She corrected 2 numbers without comment and handed it back. On a cold weekend, when heavy work had stopped being practical, The four of them stayed inside the main house. There was warm food on the table and the lantern at the center, just like the night of the first conversation, but different in every other way. It was Verka who spoke first. "When you arrived here," she said, looking at the lantern, "I thought we were going to have to fight to stay." "I thought I was going to have to negotiate much harder," said Garrett. "You negotiated with honesty." She lifted her eyes to him. "That is rare." Draugr was tearing bread with her hands and did not look up. It is not as rare as it seems. It is just uncommon among people who have never had reason to trust anyone but themselves." Thorn said nothing, but her hands were open on the table, relaxed, which for her was the equivalent of a long speech. The conversation was easy that evening. There was no weight to it. There were stories each of them told in turns, stories of before, of places they had left or lost, of things they had searched for without knowing the right name. Garrett spoke of his brother. Verka spoke of the clan that had scattered during a long drought. Thorin spoke briefly of a piece of land she had tried to work alone before finding the other two. Draugr said she had never stayed so long in one place and had no words for what she was feeling, but that she was feeling it. When the fire in the hearth sank low and the night grew deep, the four of them stepped out onto the porch for a moment before sleeping. The sky was full of cold stars. The field ahead was still. The farm, within its boundaries, was whole. Verka stood with her eyes fixed on the sky for a long moment. Then she turned her face to Garrett. "Do you have any regrets?" she asked. He thought about it honestly before answering. "Only one," he said, "that Sallow's dishonesty had to happen for four lonely people to find where they belong." Verka was quiet. Then she looked back at the sky, and something in that silence was different from all the silences before. It was full. Thorn went inside first, as always. Draugr followed, giving Garrett a quick touch on the shoulder as she passed, which was her way of saying what she did not say in words. Garrett and Verka stayed on the porch a moment longer. Far away at the very edge of the desert where the darkness grew thickest, a faint glow pulsed slowly between the rocks, too small to be fire, too steady to be an insect. Verka saw it too. "What is that?" asked Garrett. "I do not know yet," she said, her voice calm, "but it will need an answer before long." She went inside. Garrett stood watching the distant glow for a while longer, feeling that this land still held secrets he had barely begun to understand. But that night, for the first time in a very long time, he went to sleep with no weight at all in his chest.